Welcome to Narrative Nights. Step into a world of mystery, intrigue, and suspense. At Narrative Nights, we bring you thrilling detective stories that will challenge your mind and keep you guessing until the very end. Before we begin, we'd love to know, where in the world are you tuning in from? Drop a comment and let us know which part of the globe you're watching from. We're all united by the love of a good mystery. Let the investigation begin.
Miss Marple and the Secrets Beneath the Fog. Chapter 1. A Mysterious Letter. It was precisely 1 o'clock when the grandfather clock in the hallway rang its chimes, signaling the beginning of the afternoon hour. Miss Marple, her lunch of cold roast chicken with mustard and watercress nearly finished, set her knife and fork down. She leaned back in her chair, contemplating whether she might allow herself the luxury of some stewed rhubarb for dessert. As she considered, a sharp knock echoed through the front hallway of her quaint little home in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple glanced up with mild curiosity. "Now, who could that be at this hour?" she murmured to herself. Moments later, the sound of light footsteps approached, and her maid, young Edna, appeared in the doorway, her expression polite but slightly confused. "It's the postman, Em. Shall I let him in?" Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her interest piqued. "Of course, Edna. He might have something of importance to discuss." The front door creaked as it opened, and in walked the postman, a kindly man in his mid-30s. His satchel was slung over one shoulder, and his face bore the affable warmth of someone well accustomed to his rounds. He removed his cap respectfully as Edna ushered him in. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he greeted cheerfully. "How are you keeping today?" "I'm quite well, thank you, Mr. Simmons," Miss Marple replied, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "And how is your little boy? Robbie, wasn't it? The one who had that dreadful fall from the tree last month?" The postman's eyes softened with affection as he nodded. "Yes, that's our Robbie. Gave us all a fright, he did. But he's doing much better now. The doctor says he can start walking again, slowly, of course, no running about just yet." Miss Marple's expression turned serious, a knowing glint in her sharp blue eyes. "Do make sure he follows the doctor's orders precisely, Mr. Simmons. Children can be so reckless when they feel better. You don't want him rushing back into mischief too soon." "You're absolutely right. Thank you for your kind concern," he said, his face creasing into a smile. He shifted his satchel forward. "Ah, and I've got something for you today, Miss Marple." "A letter?" Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "A letter? How unusual. Not many people take the time to write proper letters these days." The postman chuckled as he reached into his bag and produced an envelope. "Well, someone's made an exception today," he said as he handed it to her. Miss Marple took the envelope delicately, her fingers tracing the familiar handwriting on the front. "Annie Grayson," she read aloud. "My word, I haven't heard from Annie in over 20 years. She turned the envelope over and read the return address, Little Skelton. "Well, that does bring back memories," she murmured, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Thank you, Mr. Simmons," she said as she handed him the envelope. With a tip of his cap, the postman excused himself and was soon gone, the sound of his boots fading down the gravel path. Miss Marple turned the envelope over in her hands, studying it for a moment. The paper felt soft and worn, a reminder of years gone by. She broke the seal carefully, her movement slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored writing paper, the ink still fresh but slightly smudged in places, revealing the hurried nature of the writer. She held the letter up and read it aloud, her voice quiet, as if speaking to herself. My dear Marple, I need you. Strange things are happening in our village, and you must come to me. Your friend, Annie. The letter was short, yet it carried a sense of urgency that made Miss Marple's heart skip a beat. No explanation, no further details, only the cryptic mention of strange things happening in Little Skelton. She sat back in her chair, the letter trembling slightly between her fingers as she mulled over the meaning. Just then, Edna reappeared, holding a small bowl of stewed rhubarb with a hopeful smile. I thought you might want something sweet to finish, she said. Miss Marple blinked, as if pulled out of a deep reverie. Thank you, Edna, but I believe I must forego the pudding today. Is everything all right? The maid asked gently, her brow furrowed with concern. Miss Marple handed her the letter. This is from Annie Grayson. We were at school together, she and I always sat in the same row. I used to beat her in the monthly tests, but come the annual exams, she always pipped me to the post. I never could figure out how. She had this way of pretending to be careless, but she was sharper than she let on. A good girl. Always had a curious mind. Edna read the letter, her face growing more concerned with each word. That's rather ominous, Do you think she's in some kind of danger? Miss Marple folded her hands on the table, her expression turning grave. I don't know, Edna. But Annie never exaggerated, not even as a child. If she says something strange is happening, then it likely is. She rose from her chair, moving with quiet purpose to the sideboard where she kept her writing materials. She opened the drawers, her mind already on the task at hand. I must go to her. Pack my travel bag, please. The black one with the tartan lining. I'll need 2 sets of walking shoes, sensible ones, and my navy coat. Edna hesitated, her concern written plainly on her face. Are you sure you want to travel today, I must, Miss Marple replied firmly, her voice calm but filled with resolve. I'll not sleep tonight wondering what trouble has found Annie. And if it's as she says, she may need someone who understands the less obvious side of things. Edna nodded and moved swiftly to the hall closet to retrieve the bag. Shall I telephone the station and check the train times? Yes, and confirm the ticket if there's a departure this evening. I'd rather be on the last train than the first tomorrow. Miss Marple folded the letter neatly and slipped it back into the envelope, her fingers lingering for a moment longer on the name and address. Little Skelton. The name evoked distant memories, stone cottages, moss-covered gates, the sharp scent of lavender, and the sound of church bells on a Sunday afternoon. She had only visited Annie's home once in her youth, but something about that place had stayed with her, lingering in her mind, like a dream half-remembered. By the time Edna returned with news of the 6:45 train, Miss Marple was already mentally preparing for the journey. She began to make her checklist, the blue wool gloves, a tin of digestive biscuits, her reading spectacles, and the small notebook she always carried in her handbag. Very well, she said, straightening the collar of her cardigan. Then tonight we go to Little Skelton. Let us hope Annie's fears are nothing more than the imaginings of a woman too fond of village gossip. But even as she said the words, a small voice inside her whispered that it was not so. The urgency in Annie's letter, the lack of explanation, and the sense of fear conveyed in her words told Miss Marple that this was no ordinary visit. As she prepared to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. And in the quiet corners of her mind, Miss Marple knew, strange things were indeed happening in Little Skelton. Chapter 2: Shadows Beneath the Mist. The train continued its journey through the fading light of the evening, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels blending with the soft sounds of the countryside slipping past. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the landscape cloaked in twilight. Miss Marple sat serenely by the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her hat perfectly in place. She watched as the last traces of daylight cast a faint glow over the fields, the hedgerows and trees fading into the creeping shadows of dusk. There was an eerie softness to the air, and the coolness hinted that a fog was already settling over the valleys and narrow lanes. As the train approached the small station of Little Skelton, the world outside seemed to shrink. The station platform was nearly deserted, save for a single flickering oil lamp casting a dim light beside the stationmaster's hut. The village seemed withdrawn from the world, silent and strangely still, as if holding its breath. At the far end of the platform, a man stood in a plain overcoat, his face unremarkable but for the respect he showed as Miss Marple alighted. He removed his cap with a slight bow and approached her. "You must be Miss Marple," he said, his voice polite but carrying the faintest undercurrent of unease. "I'm Edward, Miss Annie's servant. She asked me to meet you." "How thoughtful of her," Miss Marple replied with a warm smile. "It's been many years since I last saw Annie. I do hope she is well." Edward's expression shifted slightly, his words coming more slowly. "She's been a bit troubled lately," he admitted, leading her toward a modest carriage waiting beyond the station's iron gate. "Ever since the disappearances began." Miss Marple did not press him further, simply nodding as she allowed herself to be assisted into the carriage. The ride through the village was unnervingly quiet. The streets, although not late, were oddly empty. Shops were shuttered, and the only sign of life was the occasional flicker of candlelight peeking through curtained windows, hinting that the villagers were indoors, yet distant. It felt as if the entire community had drawn inward, retreating into its own hidden world. Annie's home was a large, stone house tucked away off the main road, surrounded by tall yew trees and an ivy-clad fence. As the carriage approached, the old wooden gate creaked open, revealing the familiar front porch and the warm glow of a lamp flickering in the parlor window. Miss Marple had visited the house years ago, but the feeling it gave her was unchanged, an odd mixture of comfort and foreboding. Before they reached the door, it opened. Annie stood there, wrapped in a thick shawl, her silver-streaked hair pinned up, her eyes wide with emotion. "Marple," she exclaimed, stepping forward quickly. "Oh, how good it is to see you again." Miss Marple embraced her gently. "It's been far too long, Annie." Annie took a step back, studying her. "You haven't changed a bit." "Only grown a little more particular about my tea," Miss Marple replied with a soft chuckle. Annie smiled, but there was tension behind her eyes. Come in," she urged. "But I insist you must rest tonight. You've had a long journey, and I don't want you exhausted before we even begin to talk about all this." Miss Marple nodded, the weight of her friend's worry apparent. "I suppose that's wise." Annie turned to Edward. "Please show Miss Marple to the guest house and make sure she has everything she needs." The guest house, a quaint little annex behind the main house, had once been an old gardener's cottage. It had been converted long ago into a comfortable space, and it exuded warmth, with fresh linens on the bed and the faint scent of lavender in the air. Miss Marple placed her bag on the dresser and looked out the window. The garden below was cloaked in a fine mist, making the trees seem taller and the spaces between them deeper. She stood at the window for a long moment before drawing the curtains shut, her mind already turning over the mystery that awaited. The next morning brought with it the comforting aroma of toast and marmalade. The sun was low in the sky, veiled by a thin shroud of fog that had not yet lifted. Miss Marple, already dressed and refreshed, walked over to the main house and found Annie waiting for her in the breakfast room. "There you are," Annie said, pouring tea. "You must be wondering why I called you here." "I am curious," Miss Marple replied as she seated herself. "You wrote of strange happenings. Annie placed a plate of scones between them and lowered her voice. "Marple, people are disappearing. Not just once or twice, but frequently. And it's not just travelers or strangers. Villagers. Neighbors. Entire families." Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly, her expression still calm, but her eye sharp with interest. "And no one has gone to the police?" Annie shook her head, her gaze uneasy. "That's the strangest part. In some cases, the relatives insist that their missing loved ones have simply moved away. In others, people whisper about it but never say a word aloud. There's fear here, Marple. Fear that makes people lie to themselves. And you mentioned someone specific in your letter," Miss Marple said, her voice steady but inquisitive. Annie nodded. "A husband and wife, David and Clara Holt. They vanished 5 days ago. Their elder son, Thomas, insists they left for personal reasons. But their younger son, John, he just returned from the city yesterday. He's terribly worried, and he suspects something much darker. I'd like to speak with him," Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. "I've invited him. He should be here soon." As if on cue, a knock echoed from the front hall. Edward opened the door to admit a tall young man with a weary expression and anxious eyes. "Miss Marple," Annie said softly, "this is John Holt." John approached, his nerves evident. "It's an honor. Miss Annie says you've helped solve mysteries before." "I've had some experience," Miss Marple replied modestly. "Please, sit down. Tell me everything you can." John sat, his hands gripping his teacup tightly. "I left for the city 3 years ago to work. I only returned yesterday. But when I got home, my parents weren't there. The house was locked, but everything inside seemed undisturbed. It was as though they'd simply vanished." "And your brother?" Miss Marple prompted. "I asked him," John said bitterly. He shrugged. "Said they probably moved on. That they'd left a note. But I never saw any note, and he couldn't even tell me when they left." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "What did the police say?" "I went straight to them. They filed a report, but the officer said I wasn't the first. He said several families had gone missing recently, but there were no leads. He almost made it sound ordinary." John paused, his face drawn with frustration. "I started asking around myself. An older man, Mr. Abernathy, said he saw my parents heading toward the mountains outside the village. It was weeks ago, but he remembers it clearly. I went there," John continued, his voice trembling slightly. "To the hills. And I found something horrible." Miss Marple remained silent, her expression one of quiet understanding, encouraging him to continue. "There were bodies," John whispered, his voice almost cracking. "Burned. Piled up. Hidden in a hollow, covered in brush. I was sure of it. I ran back, got the police, but when we returned, the place was empty. Nothing. Not even ashes. Just fresh soil, recently turned." "And the police?" Miss Marple asked. "They said I must have imagined it. That I was confused, maybe even traumatized. But I know what I saw. I can still smell it." John looked at Miss Marple, his eyes pleading. "Miss Annie said you might believe me." Miss Marple placed a hand gently over his. "I do. More importantly, I believe you believe what you saw." John gave a small, grateful sigh. Miss Marple continued, her voice steady but resolute. "Now, you must go home for today. Get some rest. Tomorrow, I'll go with you to the place where you saw the bodies. If there's something there or something missing, it will tell us more than any conversation ever could." John stood, his face filled with quiet relief. "Thank you, Miss Marple. Truly." As he left, Annie refilled Miss Marple's teacup. "Do you think there's truth to it?" she asked softly. Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked out the window toward the grey garden, lost in thought. "I don't know yet," she said finally. "But I do know this: fear makes people do strange things. And when enough people start whispering the same silence, it usually means something very wrong is being hidden." She turned back to Annie, her eyes steady with purpose. "Tomorrow," she said, "we walk into the hills." Chapter 3: Secrets Behind Closed Doors. The morning in Little Skelton was heavy with dampness, the air thick with fog that had hung over the village for days. The mist wrapped itself around the rooftops, curling like tentative fingers, shrouding the quiet village in an eerie silence. Inside Annie's house, Miss Marple sat opposite her friend, the delicate china cup warm in her hands, as Annie leaned forward with an idea. "Before we head up to the mountains," Annie said, her voice measured, "I think we should visit the Social Human Organization. It's been established here for 2 years now, and they claim to be doing all sorts of good work." Miss Marple pondered the suggestion for a moment. "Yes, that seems prudent," she replied. "A group like that might have information the rest of the village is hesitant to share. Or perhaps," she added with a small smile, "they know more than they're letting on." Annie gave a half-smile in return. "You always had a knack for reading between the lines, Marple." Within the hour, the two women found themselves walking down the uneven cobblestone path toward the modest office of the Social Human Organization. The building stood out in stark contrast to the weathered cottages around it, newly painted with bright colors. Its sign, simple block letters in blue, declared Helping Hands for Healthy Lives, with potted marigolds flanking the entrance, though one of the plants had already begun to wilt, its petals drooping. Inside, the office was clean but lacked warmth. Functional chairs, a plain desk, and neatly organized pamphlets labeled Community Outreach, Clean Water, and Youth Rehabilitation filled the space. Behind the desk sat a woman with short auburn hair and sharp, watchful eyes. She stood when they entered. "Good morning," she said with brisk cheer. "I'm Ethel Harding. You must be Miss Annie Grayson." Annie nodded. "Yes, and this is my friend, Miss Jane Marple." Ethel extended a firm handshake to Miss Marple. "A pleasure to meet you." "The pleasure's mine," Miss Marple replied, noting the firmness of the handshake and the pristine condition of Ethel's nails, small but telling details. Ethel gestured for them to sit. "I do hope we can be of service. We've made great progress in just 2 years here. Before we arrived, there was no coordinated support system, no clinics, no elderly assistance, no school refurbishments. You've expanded quite quickly, then," Miss Marple observed, her tone neutral but curious. "Oh yes," Ethel smiled. "We now have branches in 12 villages, and the number keeps growing." Annie didn't waste time. "And what about the missing people?" Ethel's expression faltered for just a moment, her smile dimming but not disappearing. "We're aware of the rumors. And yes, we've addressed them where we can. We've submitted written concerns to the local council and compiled internal reports. But without cooperation from families or formal investigations, it's difficult to take direct action." "No one has come to you for help?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but probing. "Not directly," Ethel replied, crossing her legs. "In most cases, the families don't seem eager to discuss it. But you've noticed a pattern. Miss Marple pressed. There are whispers, Ethel said, her voice taking on a slightly guarded tone. But whispering is not the same as evidence, Miss Marple. And this community has always been a little reserved. Miss Marple nodded in a way that suggested polite agreement, but her mind was already analyzing the interaction. After a few more pleasantries and promises from Ethel to provide any necessary documentation, the women left the office. That woman's very smooth, Miss Marple remarked as they walked away. She says all the right things. But there's something distant in her concern. You felt it too? Annie asked. As if she was trained to sound empathetic but didn't really care. Exactly, Miss Marple said. And more curiously, she never once asked for the names of the people we're investigating. Their next stop took them to a narrow brick house at the edge of the village, wedged between two larger estates. The home belonged to John and Thomas Holt. The house looked and cared for, with drawn curtains and an overgrown garden where weeds had pushed through the cracks in the paving stones. John greeted them at the gate, his face weary. "Come in," he said quietly. "Thomas is home." Inside, the tension was palpable. Thomas Holt, in his early 30s, was broad-shouldered and clean-shaven, but his eyes were filled with a cautious wariness. He stood as they entered the sitting room. Miss Marple spoke first. "Mr. Holt, I'm sorry to intrude, but I understand your parents have been missing for some time." 6 months, Thomas replied stiffly. "They left of their own accord." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "And you've had no contact with them since?" "No," Thomas said, his tone flat. "But it was their decision. We respected it." "But why would they leave without telling John?" "Or anyone else?" Annie asked, her voice edged with disbelief. Thomas hesitated, his expression hardening. Then, in a clipped voice, he answered, "Because they were ill. Both of them. They knew it wasn't safe to stay." Miss Marple frowned, her sharp mind noting every word. "Ill how?" "It was contagious," Thomas said, his voice lowering as if reluctant to speak. "The illness changes people. It weakens them. Everyone who's gotten it eventually leaves. They feel compelled to." John, who had remained silent until now, spoke up, his frustration spilling over. "That's not true. That's the story he's been fed by the mayor. And he's repeating it like a parrot." Miss Marple turned to Thomas, her gaze steady but unyielding. "Is that so? Has the mayor advised you on what to say?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "Mayor Edwards warned us not to panic the village. He said spreading rumors could make things worse." "Did he also tell you not to report your parents missing?" Miss Marple's voice was calm but probing. "I didn't see the point," Thomas said, a touch of defensiveness creeping into his voice. "They wanted to leave." Miss Marple looked at John, whose eyes burned with frustration. "And what do you believe happened to them?" she asked. "I think they're dead," John said quietly. "And I think someone here knows why." Miss Marple stood, her expression firm and resolute. "Well then. Tomorrow, we go to the mountains, as planned. And after that, I believe it's time we met this mayor." The afternoon light began to fade as they made their way back through the village. The sounds of children playing in a distant yard reached their ears, but the laughter was subdued, muted as though the joy had been sucked out of the day. The postman passed them with a curt nod, no longer stopping for a friendly chat. Miss Marple paused by the old war memorial in the square. The plaque, weathered by time, had names almost illegible from years of wear. The silence that surrounded it, however, felt far too heavy, oppressive even. Annie, Miss Marple said softly, have you noticed how afraid everyone seems to be of speaking too openly? Annie nodded in agreement. As if something is watching. Miss Marple didn't respond right away. Instead, she gazed toward the hills in the distance, now barely visible through the thick grey mist. Fear, she finally said, her voice calm yet filled with wisdom, is rarely caused by the unknown. More often, it's caused by knowing something and being told not to speak of it. Chapter 4: The Hidden Factory on the Hillside. The wind had picked up by the time Miss Marple, Annie, and John reached the edge of the mountains. The trees were sparse and gaunt, standing like silent sentinels on the slopes, their branches whispering in the late afternoon breeze. Overhead, grey clouds gathered, casting long, ominous shadows across the craggy earth. They stopped at a clearing where the underbrush thinned, revealing a patch of blackened, dry soil. This is it, John said with quiet certainty. Right here. I swear it. Miss Marple stepped forward slowly, her sharp eyes scanning the ground. She knelt down, brushing her gloved hand across the soil. There was no ash, no scorched bones, nothing but the cold, hard earth. You're sure you saw bodies here? Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle but firm. I saw them with my own eyes, John replied, his voice tight with frustration. Charred. Unrecognizable. There were at least 3 or 4 piled together. It was horrifying. Miss Marple stood and dusted off her skirt. And yet now, there is nothing. Annie, who had been standing at a distance, looked around uneasily. Who could clean up something like that without a trace? Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She began walking the perimeter of the clearing, examining the edges of disturbed soil and a few scattered stones. Her eyes narrowed as she spotted something faint, an unnatural smoothness along the line in the earth, perhaps tire tracks, partially covered. Subtle, but significant. Someone didn't want anyone believing you, John, Miss Marple said finally. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. And they've succeeded. Not entirely, Miss Marple replied. I've seen enough to know something happened here. Now we must ask, what happened, and who wanted it hidden? As they began their walk back down the slope, the path curved toward a broader dirt road winding through the trees. It was along this route that something unexpected appeared. Ahead of them, a tall chain-link fence rose, enclosing a vast structure made of corrugated steel. Smoke curled from 2 narrow chimneys, and the faint hum of machinery vibrated in the air. A sign hung on the gate, badly rusted, offering no clue as to the factory's purpose. Miss Marple halted. A factory, she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. In the middle of this otherwise tranquil village. Annie, equally puzzled, furrowed her brow. I don't remember seeing this before. And I've lived here my whole life. They approached the gate cautiously. A guard in a dark green uniform emerged from a small shed beside the entrance. He stood with his arms crossed, his eyes wary as they drew near. Miss Marple smiled politely. Good afternoon. Could you tell us what kind of factory this is? The guard's reply was blunt. I'm not authorized to share any information. Annie stepped forward, her voice firm. We're residents of this village. We have a right to know what's being constructed here. The guard shook his head. I'm just doing my job. No visitors allowed. No information can be disclosed. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, almost casual. Then perhaps you can at least tell us who owns it. The guard hesitated before muttering, it belongs to the mayor. Mr. Bernard Edwards. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the three of them stood in stunned silence. Miss Marple exchanged a quick glance with Annie, then turned back to the guard. "I see. Thank you." With no further information forthcoming, the trio turned and began walking back along the dirt road, but the discovery of the factory weighed heavily on their minds. Each of them was silently turning over the implications of what they had just learned. Why would the mayor own a secretive factory out here? Annie whispered. What could he be hiding? It's not just the secrecy, Miss Marple replied. It's the location. Tucked away near the mountains, far from the main road, and so close to where John claims he saw the bodies. Do you think the two are connected? John asked, his voice filled with apprehension. I think, Miss Marple said slowly, that when coincidences start piling up too neatly, one must consider the possibility of design. As they neared the village outskirts, the air grew heavier, not just with mist, but with an unspoken tension. Just as they rounded a bend, a crowd of people emerged ahead, men and women dressed in dark coats, clustered around a central figure who stood taller than the rest. It was the mayor. Bernard Edwards, a man in his 50s with a clean-shaven face, had the polished look of a career politician. His practiced smile faded the moment he saw John, and his gaze darkened. You again, the mayor said sharply. I thought I told you to stop this. I'm not doing anything wrong, John shot back, his stance defiant. The mayor's eye shifted to Miss Marple. And you, madam, wherever you came from, I suggest you go back. This is not your concern. His voice remained civil, but there was a biting undertone, an unmistakable warning. I'm merely visiting an old friend, Miss Marple said with a pleasant smile. And taking an interest in local matters. Villages are so full of stories, aren't they? The mayor's eyes narrowed, and without another word, he turned sharply and walked away, his entourage trailing behind him like a silent shadow. Annie exhaled slowly, her expression a mix of surprise and confusion. That was not the greeting I expected. Miss Marple stood still for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. No. But it confirmed one thing for me. What's that? Annie asked. That we're very close to something someone does not want found. As they parted ways in the village square, Miss Marple turned to John. Come to Annie's house tomorrow morning, she said. We must look deeper into this factory. Its presence, its secrecy, and its connection to the missing. John nodded. I'll be there. With that, he made his way back to his home, while Miss Marple and Annie walked slowly back to the house. The air had grown cooler, and a sharp breeze rustled the hedge near the front gate. Inside, Annie lit the fireplace and brought out tea, but Miss Marple declined. She stood at the window, staring out toward the hills, her mind racing. I've known quiet villages all my life, she said softly. They whisper in hedgerows, in church pews, over garden fences. But here, Annie, here, it's too quiet. It's as if the village has forgotten how to speak. Annie watched her friend, concern etched on her face. What do you think is happening? Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She tapped her fingers lightly against the windowsill, her thoughts far away. I think, she said at last, we're about to find out. Chapter 5, The Bitter Truth. The morning unfolded with a pale sun struggling to break through the stubborn fog, casting a ghostly light over Little Skelton. The village stirred slowly, as though reluctant to face another day weighed down by its secrets. But inside Annie's house, the mood was far from sluggish. John arrived just after 7, his face etched with anxiety but determined resolve. Miss Marple was already seated at the breakfast table, sipping her tea in quiet concentration. Annie, pacing the length of the parlor, paused when she saw him. "Are you ready?" she asked. John nodded, his expression tense. "I couldn't sleep at all last night." "Then let's not waste another moment," Miss Marple said, placing her cup down gently. "We'll take the east path around the hill, toward the back of the factory. I'd like to see what secrets they've tried to keep hidden." With that, the trio set off, winding through narrow footpaths bordered by woods. The trees were thinning for winter and brittle leaves crunched underfoot. After a brisk 20-minute walk, they arrived at a rusted chain-link fence that marked the rear of the factory complex. A neglected service gate stood nearby, with a few battered crates scattered across the grass. John was the first to spot it. "There," he pointed, his voice low. "Something spilled." They moved closer. Around the crates were broken blister packs, torn labels, crushed plastic containers, and soggy cardboard cartons, some half covered in soil, others stained with a strange brown residue. The acrid, bitter smell hung in the air, unmistakable. Miss Marple leaned in, delicately using her umbrella to pick up one of the discarded packages. She studied the label carefully. Valadryl, batch 32C, not for distribution. "Medicine," she murmured. "But improperly disposed of. And this batch, it's been marked as unusable." Annie's face flushed with anger. "This is outrageous. The mayor has built an illegal pharmaceutical factory right here in our village." "Worse," Miss Marple said softly, her gaze steady. "He's producing defective medicine and dumping the evidence." John stood silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the ground. "How long has this been going on?" "Long enough," Miss Marple replied grimly. "And perhaps long enough to cost lives." Annie took a sharp breath. "We must go to the police. Right now." Miss Marple nodded. "And the sooner, the better. But we must keep our heads. We're dealing with a man who has carefully built his power. He will not fall easily." As they made their way through the village toward the police station, wood seemed to travel ahead of them. People began emerging from their doorways, some cautious, others curious. A few villagers quietly approached, as if waiting for someone to finally ask the right questions. An elderly man, his back stooped with age, tugged at Annie's sleeve. "I heard you were looking into the factory," he said, his voice hushed. "My nephew worked there. Disappeared 2 months ago. They told me he'd gone to the city, but he never said a word about it to me." A woman carrying a basket of eggs added, "My neighbor's boy worked there too. Disappeared last spring. No goodbyes. No farewells. They said he ran away, but he wasn't the type." The whispers grew louder as they passed through the square. A shopkeeper, peering out from behind the counter, leaned forward. "I kept quiet. Everyone did. But I knew something was wrong when they started boarding up the windows on the upper floors." It was John who paused, his brow furrowed as he processed the information. "Wait. Are you saying my parents, did they work there too?" A graying man, his face tired and lined with years of hardship, nodded. "Your father was hired as a technician. Your mother helped with packaging. Everyone knew." John stood motionless for a moment, the revelation sinking in. "But I didn't. My brother never told me any of this." Miss Marple placed a hand gently on his arm. "Because someone wanted to keep it hidden, John. Someone who feared what the truth might unravel." The police station was modest, located beside the village post office. Inside, Sergeant Wilcox, a sturdy man with a thick moustache and a skeptical expression, was seated behind his desk, reading a ledger. He looked up as they entered. "Miss Marple," he said with a grunt. You again? I'm afraid so, Sergeant, she replied, her voice calm. But I believe this visit will be more serious than the last. She proceeded to explain everything, the back gate, the dumped medicines, the testimonies from the villagers, and the secrecy surrounding the mayor's factory. As she spoke, Sergeant Wilcox's expression grew darker. Do you have evidence? He asked. Miss Marple nodded. We have physical samples, photographs, and witnesses. We brought one of the medicine packs with us. Sergeant Wilcox stood up. That's enough to get started. Within the hour, a small convoy of officers accompanied them back to the factory. The front gates were locked, but the side entrance was unlocked, and they slipped inside. The officers immediately began searching the premises. Inside, they found assembly tables, chemical vats, and rooms filled with unsorted, improperly stored medical supplies. Documents bearing the mayor's signature were quickly located in an upstairs office. Some of the papers were hastily shoved into filing cabinets, while others were left lying around in piles. The officers snapped photographs and took detailed notes, their suspicions confirmed with each piece of evidence they uncovered. Miss Marple stood back, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. The air was thick with the stench of chemicals, and the atmosphere was suffocating. The factory was clearly abandoned in haste, the sign of a quick cover-up. As the officers worked, she felt a growing sense of certainty this wasn't just a case of negligence. It was a carefully orchestrated crime, hidden in plain sight. Look at this, one of the officers called out, holding up a file folder. This document here states that the mayor was involved in the approval of this facility's setup. Miss Marple stepped closer, her mind already racing through the implications. The mayor has been directly involved in the operation of this factory, she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. Not just as the owner, but as someone who ensured its existence. Annie stood beside her, shaking her head. But why? Why would he put the whole village at risk like this? Miss Marple turned to her, her face grim. Power, Annie. And greed. The mayor was hiding something much larger than we can see. And now, we're uncovering it. The officers continued to document their findings, while Sergeant Wilcox took Miss Marple aside. We'll need your help to process everything, he said. But this is bigger than just a simple investigation now. It looks like the mayor's involved in something far more dangerous. Indeed, Miss Marple replied, her voice cold. And I suspect the disappearance of those people, your parents included, is no coincidence. As the police began to move forward with the investigation, Miss Marple, Annie, and John stood outside the factory, watching the officers work. The sense of impending danger hung in the air, but Miss Marple remained calm, her sharp mind already piecing together the puzzle. We must stay focused, Miss Marple said quietly. There is much more to uncover, but I believe we are getting closer to the heart of this. John looked at her, a mixture of disbelief and determination in his eyes. What happens now? We expose the truth, Miss Marple replied. And we stop whatever the mayor has planned before it's too late. As they watched the police work, the fog began to lift slightly, revealing the distant hills. The village, once so quiet and peaceful, now felt like a powder keg waiting to explode. And Miss Marple knew that the hardest part was still to come. Chapter 6: The Veil of Deception. The atmosphere inside the Little Skelton police station was thick with unease. Although the mayor had been arrested and the illegal medicine factory sealed, Miss Marple's mind remained far from settled. The case of the missing villagers, coupled with John's disturbing claim about burned bodies, continued to gnaw at her thoughts, pressing her forward in her search for the truth. Seated in the modest office, Miss Marple leaned slightly toward Inspector Holloway, her expression calm, though her eyes gleamed with sharp focus. "Inspector," she said softly, "I am convinced that the missing persons and the factory are connected. And I do not believe young John imagined what he saw in the mountains. Someone went to great lengths to remove those remains. That alone speaks volumes." The inspector rubbed his chin thoughtfully. But the mayor denied knowing anything about the bodies. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, her tone steady. "And perhaps he truly doesn't know. But I find his ignorance too convenient." At that moment, Bernard Edwards, the mayor, was ushered into the interview room. His usual air of composure had slipped, his collar was slightly askew, and his eyes darted warily around the room. Despite his evident discomfort, he still carried himself with the calculated confidence of a man accustomed to controlling the narrative. Miss Marple was granted permission to question him, with the inspector present as a silent observer. "Mr. Edwards," she began, her voice even, "when I asked you about the possibility of burned bodies in the mountains, you claimed to have no knowledge of such a thing. Is that still your position?" The mayor's response was curt. "Yes," he said flatly. "I've never heard of any bodies. And if there were such a thing, I imagine someone would have found them long ago." Miss Marple raised a single eyebrow. "Curious, then, that your only suggestion was to direct suspicion toward a magician living alone in the hills." The mayor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I was merely offering a possibility. He's a strange man, always has been. People in the village are wary of him. He keeps to himself, mutters incantations, burns odd things in the night. Who else could it be?" Inspector Holloway glanced at Miss Marple before standing and ordering a constable to assemble a search party for the mountains. Within the hour, 3 officers had departed, and by late afternoon they returned with the so-called magician in tow. The man, whose real name was Bramwell, looked far more like a recluse than a sorcerer. Dressed in mismatched layers of wool and fur, his eyes darted nervously around the room, betraying a man long unused to human company. When questioned about the burned remains, Bramwell denied any involvement. "I don't kill people," he said vehemently. "I've never harmed anyone. I use animals, chickens, mostly, for rituals. Nothing illegal. It's all for energy and protection." "Do you burn the bodies of the animals?" the inspector asked. "Yes," Bramwell nodded. "On ceremonial altars. In the woods. But never near that clearing the boy mentioned." "And do you know anything about the missing villagers?" the inspector pressed. Bramwell shook his head. "I live alone. I have no interest in what the rest of the village does." Inspector Holloway turned to Miss Marple, who had remained quiet during the questioning, her hands folded neatly on the table. "Well?" the inspector asked. "I believe him," Miss Marple said simply. "He may be eccentric, but not a killer. And if he were hiding something as serious as this, we would have sensed it. There's no blood on his conscience." The mayor, who had been listening from an adjoining room, was brought back in. Miss Marple turned her attention to him once again. "So if it wasn't the magician," she said, her voice steady, "perhaps we should return to what was under your control, the factory." The mayor's expression shifted from irritation to frustration. "I told you already, that factory isn't mine. I didn't build it. I don't operate it." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. "But you benefit from it." "Yes," he admitted, his voice tight. "I get a share. That's all. I allowed it to be built on unused land. In return, I get quarterly compensation. I don't ask questions. I don't want trouble. Then whose factory is it? The mayor hesitated, looking away briefly before answering. It belongs to Madame Ethel, the woman who runs the social human organization. A stunned silence settled over the room. Even Inspector Holloway seemed taken aback. Ethel Harding? Miss Marple asked, her voice a whisper of disbelief. The mayor nodded slowly. Yes. She came to the village 2 years ago. Presented herself as a humanitarian. Said she wanted to bring social work, help the poor, offer jobs to the unemployed. She was persuasive. Had paperwork. Grants. Permits. All very professional. So I let her set up shop. But she didn't just set up the welfare office, did she? Miss Marple pressed. No, the mayor admitted, his face flushed with frustration. The factory came later. She claimed it was for research. Said it would create local employment. I didn't see a reason to stop her. And you never questioned the illegal disposal of medicines? Miss Marple asked, her tone tinged with disbelief. I never went near the place, the mayor snapped, his voice defensive. I kept my distance. I didn't want to know. I just wanted the money. Miss Marple sighed softly. That's often the first step toward allowing evil to take root. The inspector stood abruptly. We'll be bringing Madame Ethel in for questioning. Later that evening, as the sky turned violet over Little Skelton, Miss Marple and Annie sat together in the drawing room, the fire crackling gently between them. So, Annie said, pouring tea, it was her all along. Perhaps, Miss Marple replied, her gaze distant. Or perhaps she's only part of the picture. What matters is that the web is beginning to unravel. The factory wasn't just a front for illegal pharmaceuticals, it was hiding something much darker. And Madame Ethel, with her perfect posture and well-rehearsed charm, may not be the savior the village believed her to be. Annie nodded slowly. We trusted her. We trusted the organization. That, Miss Marple said, accepting her tea with a thoughtful expression, is exactly how people like her succeed. The fire flickered as the two women sat in silence, the growing realization of the town's secret sinking in. Miss Marple knew they were on the brink of uncovering something much more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Chapter 7: The Bitter Truth Revealed. The air inside the Little Skelton police station was thick with tension, the weight of anticipation hanging over every corner. The once quiet reception area was now a hub of activity. Officers moved between rooms, villagers whispered in hushed tones, and the steady murmur of statements being recorded filled the space. Miss Marple sat silently by the window, watching the scene unfold with her usual calm demeanor, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. Ethel Harding had arrived earlier that morning, escorted by the police. She appeared paler than usual, her lips pressed tightly in defiance. Alongside her were several factory workers, men and women of various ages, all of them wearing the same dull expression of exhaustion and resignation. However, something else caught Miss Marple's attention. Each one of them was coughing. Not lightly or occasionally, but with a dry, persistent, and painful-sounding hack. The sound echoed from one person to the next, as if they shared not only a workplace but a slowly consuming affliction. Leaning toward Inspector Holloway, Miss Marple spoke softly. "Would you mind calling for a physician to examine them?" she asked, her voice calm but filled with concern. "There's something very wrong here." The inspector, now well accustomed to Miss Marple's instincts, nodded and immediately made the call. By midday, a young doctor from the next village arrived. He was efficient and thorough, examining each of the workers one by one. Afterward, he returned to the inspector and Miss Marple with grim news. They're all suffering from advanced tuberculosis, he reported. Every last one of them. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. And what caused this? Yes, the doctor replied, the cause is clear. Prolonged exposure to industrial pollutants, specifically smoke laden with unfiltered chemicals. It's likely the factory's ventilation system is either faulty or completely non-existent. These people have been breathing poison. Before the weight of this revelation could fully sink in, more villagers began arriving at the station, mothers with teary eyes, elderly men with trembling hands, children clutching faded photographs. One by one, they spoke of family members who had gone missing over the past year. My husband worked there, one woman said, her voice breaking. He came home coughing every night. And then one day, he never returned. My daughter was hired as a cleaner, another woman said. We were told she ran away. But I knew something was wrong. She had that same cough. The room fell into a tense hush as more testimonies were given. Ethel Harding, seated in the interrogation room, could no longer maintain her calm deflections. When the inspector and Miss Marple returned, bearing the mounting evidence and the doctor's report, Ethel sighed deeply and closed her eyes. Fine, she muttered, her voice resigned. What's the point of denying it any longer? She sank back in her chair and began to speak. I started the social human organization to appear legitimate, Ethel admitted, her voice tinged with bitterness. It was easy to win people's trust, especially in quiet, forgotten villages like this one. The people here are desperate. They want to believe someone cares. Her gaze fell to her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. In the city, I was drowning. Too many regulations. Too many inspections. Too many taxes. Labor was expensive. Complaints were endless. So I found this place. No oversight. Cheap land. Cheap labor. And villagers too naive to question anything. And the factory? Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but insistent. I built it under the organization's name, Ethel continued. I told people it was for medical research and packaging, and that it would bring employment and prosperity. In truth, we were producing substandard medicine, low-cost batches for export to markets that didn't ask too many questions. It was all profit. No accountability. Miss Marple's voice remained calm and measured. And the workers who fell ill. Ethel's eyes darkened, and for the first time, her mask of control began to crack. I couldn't let the truth get out. If word spread that the factory was making people sick, it would destroy everything. Investors would pull out. Officials might start asking questions. So you silenced them, Miss Marple said. Ethel nodded slowly. When a worker showed signs of serious illness, coughing, fever, weight loss, I knew it was only a matter of time. So I had them removed. John, who had been standing silently behind the door, suddenly stepped forward. You murdered them. Ethel didn't flinch. They were already dying. I told myself it was mercy. I told myself I had no choice. And the bodies? Miss Marple asked. At first, we burned them, Ethel said coldly. There's a clearing behind the mountains. We made the fires look like controlled waste burns. But then John started poking around. She looked directly at him. You saw what you weren't supposed to. That's when I ordered the bodies moved. We dumped them into the drainage canal beyond the old ravine. The stench would be masked by the runoff from the factory. No one would ever find them. John's face turned pale as the truth hit him. They were my parents, weren't they? Ethel didn't answer. Tears welled up in John's eyes as he turned away, his shoulders shaking silently. Annie stepped forward and placed a hand gently on his back, her own eyes misting with tears. By evening, the case was formalized. Ethel Harding was charged with multiple counts of murder, medical negligence, unlawful disposal of bodies, and operating an illegal pharmaceutical facility. The mayor, who had enabled her operations in exchange for a share of the profits, was charged with criminal conspiracy, aiding and abetting, and obstruction of justice. Both were denied bail and would be transferred to the city for trial. Later that night, Miss Marple and Annie sat once again by the hearth, the fire crackling softly between them. "It's over," Annie said quietly, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "At last." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently, her gaze distant. "In part," she replied. "Justice takes many forms. Some visible, some slower to unfold. This village will need time. Healing. But it will come." John visited before turning in for the night. He stood by the door, looking at Miss Marple with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you," he said simply. "I thought I was going mad. I thought no one would believe me." "I believed you," Miss Marple said with a warm smile. "Because grief doesn't lie." As the night deepened and the fire flickered low, the weight of the day's revelation settled over the room. Miss Marple knew that the path to justice had been hard-fought, but that the truth had a way of emerging, no matter how deeply it was buried. And for Little Skelton, that truth was just the beginning of its long road to recovery.